You know, sometimes the most life-changing moments don't come with warning signs or dramatic music. They sneak up on you in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, disguised as a simple phone call or an unexpected email. Jimmy Fallon had been hosting The Tonight Show for years at this point, and somewhere between the celebrity interviews and the musical guests and the comedy sketches, something inside him had grown quiet. Not unhappy exactly, just settled. The kind of settled that happens when you've done something so many times that your hands move before your brain does, when laughter comes from your mouth but doesn't quite reach the center of your chest anymore. He loved his job, truly loved it, but there's a difference between loving something and feeling alive inside of it. And Jimmy hadn't felt that particular kind of alive in longer than he wanted to admit. So when his producers pitched the idea of doing a segment where he would train with the stunt team from the John Wick films, Jimmy's first instinct was to laugh it off. "You want me to do what? Throw punches? Roll around on mats?" He pictured himself flailing through a fight sequence, imagined the YouTube comments tearing him apart. Jimmy Fallon was a lot of things, a comedian, a musician, a pretty decent impressionist, but an action star, that wasn't his lane. He had never been particularly athletic. He had never been the kind of guy who walked into a room and commanded physical presence. But his team pushed, and somewhere beneath his resistance, a small ember of curiosity flickered. He remembered being a kid watching action movies with his dad, pretending the living room was a dojo, throwing imaginary punches at invisible enemies. He remembered feeling invincible. When had he stopped feeling that way? When had he started believing he was only allowed to occupy certain spaces, play certain roles? What Jimmy didn't know, what nobody told him until the morning of the training, was that Keanu Reeves himself would be there. The drive to the training facility felt longer than it should have. Jimmy's palms were sweating against the steering wheel, and he kept rehearsing jokes in his head, the way he always did when he was nervous. Humor was his armor. It had been since childhood, since the days when making people laugh was the only way he knew how to feel safe in a room. But something told him that jokes weren't going to help him here. Something told him he was about to step into a space where his usual tricks wouldn't work. The facility was nothing like what he expected. He had imagined something flashy, Hollywood-polished, full of mirrors and ego. Instead, it was simple, almost humble. Worn mats on the floor. Walls covered not with posters of blockbuster films, but with handwritten notes, training philosophies, names of students who had pushed through their limits and come out different on the other side. It smelled like sweat and discipline, and something else Jimmy couldn't name. Something that made his stomach tighten. And then Keanu walked in. There's a quality some people have, a stillness that isn't passive, a quiet that isn't empty. Keanu moved through the room like he had all the time in the world, like every step was intentional, like he was fully present in his own body in a way that most people never learn to be. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just was. And in that moment, standing across from him, Jimmy felt something he hadn't felt in years, small, not in a bad way. Small in the way you feel when you stand at the edge of the ocean and realize how vast everything is. Small in a way that made him want to grow. Keanu extended his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, warm but not overly familiar. "Thanks for coming," he said, and the way he said it, like Jimmy was doing him a favor, like this was a gift and not a comedy bit, made Jimmy's prepared jokes dissolve on his tongue. "I should probably warn you," Jimmy managed, forcing a smile. "I'm about as coordinated as a baby giraffe on roller skates." Keanu didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it either. He just looked at Jimmy with those eyes that had seen tragedy and loss and somehow still carried kindness, and he said something that would echo in Jimmy's mind for days afterward. Everyone who walks through that door says something like that, and every single one of them is wrong about themselves. The training began slowly. Basic stances, breathing techniques, the way you plant your feet, the way you hold your center, the way you let energy move through your body instead of fighting against it. Jimmy stumbled. He laughed at himself constantly, deflecting his embarrassment with self-deprecating humor. But every time he cracked a joke, every time he tried to turn his failure into a punchline, Keanu would pause and wait. Just wait. Not judging, not impatient. Just present. "You don't have to be funny right now," Keanu said after the fifth or sixth joke. His voice was gentle, but there was weight behind it. "You can just be here, you can just be learning." Jimmy felt something crack open inside his chest. a small fissure in a wall he hadn't even realized he'd built. For the next 2 hours he threw punches, he missed. He threw them again, he fell, he got up. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, and somewhere in the middle of all that struggle something shifted. He stopped thinking about how he looked. He stopped worrying about the cameras that would eventually capture this for television. He stopped performing. For the first time in years, Jimmy Fallon was just a man in a room, trying to learn something new and failing and trying again. When the session ended, he was drenched in sweat, his hands trembling slightly, his body aching in places he didn't know could ache. But there was something else too, a brightness behind his eyes, a heat in his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "Same time tomorrow." Jimmy blinked. "Tomorrow? I thought this was a one-day thing." Keanu smiled. It was a small smile, quiet, but it reached his eyes. One day isn't enough to learn anything real. One day is just the beginning. And that's when Jimmy realized this wasn't going to be a comedy segment. This was going to be something else entirely. Something that scared him. Something that called to the parts of himself he had spent decades burying beneath laughter and applause. He should have said no. He had 100 reasons to say no. His schedule, his obligations, the voice in his head that whispered he wasn't built for this. But when he opened his mouth, the word that came out surprised him. "Okay." He drove home that night in silence. No music, no phone calls, no distractions. Just him and the road and the questions rising like smoke in his mind. What if Keanu was right? What if everything he believed about himself was wrong? And more terrifying still, what would he find if he actually had the courage to look? The next morning, Jimmy woke up unable to move. Every muscle in his body was on fire, and for a split second he considered calling the whole thing off. But then he remembered the way Keanu had looked at him, not with pity, not with doubt, but with something that felt dangerously close to belief. And he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he had to go back. He had to know what was waiting on the other side of his fear. The second day was worse than the first. Jimmy had expected the soreness. He wasn't naive enough to think his body would forgive him for those 2 hours of punishment. But what he hadn't expected was the depth of it, the way pain had settled into muscles he didn't even know existed, the way getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain made of broken glass. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror that morning and barely recognized the man staring back at him. Same face, same tired eyes, same smile lines carved by years of laughter. But something underneath was different. Something was shifting, rearranging itself, and he couldn't tell yet whether it was building something new or simply preparing to collapse. His wife found him standing there, frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the sink. She didn't say anything at first. She just watched him the way she always did when she knew something was happening beneath the surface, something he wasn't ready to talk about yet. After 14 years of marriage, she had learned to read the silences between his words, the spaces where the real Jimmy lived, the one who didn't perform, the one who carried fears he never spoke out loud. "You don't have to go back," she said finally. Her voice was soft, free of judgment. "It was just supposed to be a segment. Nobody expects you to." "I know," he interrupted, but he didn't turn around. He couldn't look at her because if he did, he might actually listen. He might actually give himself permission to quit, and something in him, something small and stubborn and newly awake, refused to let that happen. He drove to the facility with his hands aching on the steering wheel, every red light feeling like a chance to turn around. The voice in his head was relentless. "You're not an athlete. You're a comedian. You make people laugh. That's your job. This isn't your world. You don't belong here." The voice sounded reasonable. It sounded kind, even like it was trying to protect him from embarrassment, from failure, from the inevitable moment when everyone would realize he was in over his head. But there was another voice too, quieter, harder to hear. And it was asking a question he couldn't ignore. What if the first voice is lying? What if it's been lying your whole life? Keanu was already there when Jimmy arrived. He was sitting on the edge of the mat, legs crossed, eyes closed, breathing slowly. There was something almost sacred about the image. This man who had played assassins and saviors, who had experienced losses most people couldn't fathom, sitting in perfect stillness like he had made peace with every demon that ever haunted him. Jimmy hesitated at the door, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a space that demanded more than he knew how to give. But then Keanu opened his eyes, and his face broke into that quiet, genuine smile. "You came back." "Almost didn't," Jimmy admitted. He hadn't planned to say that out loud. The words just escaped, slipping past his usual defenses. Keanu nodded slowly, like this was the most natural confession in the world. "The second day is always the hardest. Your body is screaming at you to stop. Your mind is inventing 1,000 reasons why this was a mistake." He paused, and his eyes held Jimmy's with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "But you're here. That means something." They started with stretching this time. Slow, deliberate movements designed to ease the stiffness, to remind the body that it was capable of more than it believed. Jimmy winced through every stretch, his muscles protesting, his joints popping in ways that couldn't possibly be healthy. But Keanu moved beside him, matching his pace, never pushing too hard, never making him feel like he was falling behind. "Can I ask you something?" Jimmy said, halfway through a stretch that was making his hamstrings weep. "Anything." "How do you do it? How do you?" He struggled to find the words. "How do you walk into a room and just be so present, so calm? I've spent my whole career trying to control how people see me, trying to make sure they're laughing, making sure they're comfortable. But you don't seem to need any of that. You just exist, and somehow that's enough." Keanu was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Jimmy hadn't heard before. "I spent a lot of years not being present, after my daughter died, after my girlfriend died." He said the words simply, without drama, but Jimmy felt them land like stones in still water. "I spent years running from the pain, trying to fill the silence with noise, trying to outrun the grief, and it almost destroyed me." Jimmy stopped stretching. He sat there on the mat, suddenly aware that this conversation had crossed into territory far deeper than celebrity small talk. Keanu had never really talked publicly about his losses in detail, not like this, not with this kind of raw honesty. The world knew the headlines, the tragedy, the tabloid versions, but this was different. This was the truth underneath the headlines. "What changed?" Jimmy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu met his eyes. "I stopped running. I stopped trying to be okay, and I just let myself be broken for a while, and somewhere in that brokenness I found something I didn't expect." He placed his hand flat against his own chest. "I found that the pain wasn't trying to destroy me. It was trying to teach me. It was trying to show me that I was stronger than I thought, that I could survive things I never imagined surviving." He paused. "The stillness you see, it's not the absence of pain. It's the presence of everything, the good and the bad, the joy and the grief, all of it held together without running." Jimmy felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes, and for once he didn't try to blink them away. He didn't crack a joke. He didn't deflect. He just let himself feel the weight of what Keanu was sharing, the gift of vulnerability being offered across that worn-out training mat. The rest of the session was different. Harder in some ways, they moved into combat drills, blocks, strikes, combinations that required precision and focus. Jimmy failed repeatedly. His timing was off. His movements were clumsy. He telegraphed every punch left openings a real opponent would exploit in seconds. But every time he stumbled, Keanu was there, not to criticize, not to fix, just to witness. Just to say, without words, keep going. 3 hours in, something broke. It wasn't physical, though his body was screaming, pushed past every limit he thought he had. It was something inside. A wall. A barrier he had built so gradually, so carefully, that he had forgotten it was even there. All those years of making people laugh. All those years of being the funny guy, the safe guy, the one who never demanded too much, never made anyone uncomfortable. All those years of shrinking himself to fit into the space the world expected him to occupy. He was throwing a punch, a simple jab, nothing complicated, and suddenly his arm stopped mid-motion. His chest seized, and without warning, without permission, a sob ripped out of his throat. He stood there in the middle of the training floor, a 49-year-old man who had made millions of people laugh, crying like a child who had just realized he was lost. The tears came fast and hot, and he couldn't stop them. He didn't even understand where they were coming from. It was like his body was releasing something ancient, something that had been locked away so long it had become part of his foundation. Keanu didn't rush to comfort him. He didn't tell him it was okay. He just stood a few feet away, solid and present, and let Jimmy fall apart. When the tears finally slowed, Jimmy wiped his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed, exposed, more vulnerable than he had ever been in front of another person. "I don't know what just happened," he said, his voice raw. Keanu walked over and sat down beside him on the mat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The facility was quiet except for the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of the air conditioning. "When you train your body," Keanu said finally, "you're not just training your muscles, you're training your spirit. You're confronting every lie you've ever told yourself about who you are and what you're capable of. And sometimes when those lies start to crack, everything you've been holding back comes flooding out." He looked at Jimmy, and there was something in his eyes that felt like recognition, like he had been exactly where Jimmy was right now. "That's not weakness, that's courage. That's the bravest thing a person can do. Let themselves break so they can rebuild." Jimmy stared at the floor, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand who he was becoming in this strange, liminal space between the man he had been and the man he might become. "I've spent my whole life trying to make people happy," he said, the words coming slow like he was discovering them as he spoke. "I thought that was my purpose. I thought if I could just keep everyone laughing, keep everyone comfortable, then I was doing something good. But somewhere along the way, I forgot about myself. I forgot to ask if I was happy. I forgot to ask if I was being real or just performing a version of myself that everyone else wanted to see." Keanu nodded. Most people spend their whole lives performing. They never stop long enough to ask who they really are underneath the performance. The fact that you're asking now, that's everything. They sat together in silence for a long time. The afternoon light was fading outside, casting long shadows across the training floor. Jimmy's body ached. His eyes were swollen from crying. He felt hollowed out and raw, like a wound that had just been cleaned. But underneath all of that, he felt something else, something new. A flicker of something he couldn't name yet, but that felt like the beginning of change. When he finally stood up to leave, his legs unsteady, his whole body trembling, Keanu stopped him at the door. "Jimmy," his voice was quiet but firm. "What happened today, don't be ashamed of it, don't bury it, let it change you." Jimmy looked back at this man who had survived unspeakable loss, who had transformed his pain into purpose, who had somehow found peace in a world that seemed designed to break him. And he realized, with a clarity that took his breath away, that he was standing at a crossroads. He could go back to his life. He could file this away as a weird emotional episode, laugh it off, return to the safety of the stage and the jokes and the endless performances. Nobody would blame him. Nobody would even know. Or he could keep going. He could walk into the fire and let it burn away everything that wasn't real. He could find out who he was on the other side of the fear. He didn't answer out loud. He just nodded once, a silent promise to himself as much as to Keanu, and walked out into the fading daylight. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his wife breathing softly beside him, and he thought about all the versions of himself he had been over the years. The class clown who made jokes to survive, the young comedian desperate for approval, the talk show host who smiled even when his heart was breaking. Layer after layer of performance, stacked so high he had lost sight of the foundation underneath. Who was he, really? Without the laughter, without the applause, without the carefully constructed image that had carried him this far. He didn't know, but for the first time in his life, he wanted to find out. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The next morning, Jimmy called his producers and told them he was extending the training. Not for a week, not for a month. He didn't know how long. He just knew he wasn't finished yet. There was something waiting for him on the other side of this, something he had to discover. And he was willing to risk everything, his schedule, his reputation, his carefully maintained image to find it. What he didn't know was that the hardest part was still coming, and it would test him in ways he never could have imagined. 3 weeks into training, Jimmy Fallon stopped recognizing himself. Not in the dramatic way movies portray transformation. There was no montage, no swelling music, no moment where he suddenly became someone new. It was slower than that, quieter, like watching ice melt, so gradual you couldn't pinpoint when the solid became liquid, when the frozen became free. His body was changing, yes. The softness around his midsection was giving way to something firmer. His posture had shifted, shoulders back, chin lifted, feet planted with an intention he had never possessed before. But the real changes were happening in places no camera could capture. He started waking up before his alarm, not because he was anxious about training, but because his body craved it now. The movement, the challenge, the feeling of pushing against his own limits and discovering they were further away than he had believed. He found himself breathing differently throughout the day, catching moments when his chest would tighten with old anxieties and consciously releasing them, the way Keanu had taught him. He noticed things he had never noticed before. The way his daughters looked at him when he walked into a room. The way his wife's hand felt in his, really felt, when he wasn't distracted by his phone or his next monologue or the endless noise inside his own head. But there was a darkness creeping in alongside the light. The more present he became, the more clearly he could see everything he had been avoiding. It started with small memories, moments from his past that would surface without warning during training sessions, a comment from a producer years ago telling him he wasn't edgy enough, a review that called him aggressively inoffensive. The look on his father's face at his first big comedy show, pride mixed with something else, something that might have been confusion, like he couldn't quite reconcile the son he raised with the performer on stage. Jimmy had buried these moments deep, paved over them with success and accolades and the constant reassurance of audience laughter. But now, with nowhere to hide, they were rising to the surface like bodies from a lake. One afternoon, midway through a particularly grueling session, Keanu stopped him mid-combination. "Where are you right now?" Jimmy blinked, disoriented. His fists were still raised, his stance still set, but his eyes had gone distant. He hadn't even realized he had drifted. "I'm here, I'm right here." "No," Keanu shook his head slowly. "Your body is here, but you left about 2 minutes ago. Where did you go?" The question hung in the air between them. Jimmy lowered his fists, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He walked to the edge of the mat and sat down heavily, his back against the wall, his head tilted up toward the ceiling. "I was thinking about my dad," he said finally. The words came out rough, unpolished, nothing like the smooth delivery he had spent decades perfecting. "He died a few years ago, and I keep thinking about all the conversations we never had, all the things I never asked him, all the things I never told him." Keanu sat down beside him, not too close, not too far, just present. "What would you have told him?" Jimmy closed his eyes. The training facility faded away. The sounds of the city outside dissolved into nothing. And suddenly he was back in his childhood living room, watching his father watch television, wishing he had the courage to bridge the silence between them. "I would have told him I was scared," Jimmy whispered. "My whole life I've been scared, scared of failing, scared of being forgotten, scared that if I stopped being funny, stopped being entertaining, people would realize there was nothing underneath, that I was just empty." He opened his eyes and turned to look at Keanu. "You want to know the real reason I said yes to this? It wasn't for the segment. It wasn't for the content or the views or any of that. It was because when I saw you on screen, when I watched John Wick take on entire armies without flinching, I wanted to feel like that. Just once. I wanted to know what it felt like to be someone who wasn't afraid." Keanu was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than Jimmy had ever heard it. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it." He leaned forward slightly, making sure Jimmy was looking at him. "I am afraid every single day. I'm afraid of losing the people I love. I'm afraid of not living up to my potential. I'm afraid of dying with regrets, with things unsaid, with love unexpressed." He paused. "The difference isn't the absence of fear. The difference is the decision to move forward anyway, to let the fear exist without letting it control you." Jimmy felt something shift in his chest. It was such a simple idea, so obvious that he should have understood it decades ago. But hearing it from this man in this place, after everything he had experienced over the past 3 weeks, it landed differently. It landed like truth. "How do you do that?" Jimmy asked. "How do you move forward when the fear is so loud you can barely hear anything else?" Keanu smiled, but it was a sad smile weighted with memory. "You start with one step, then another, and eventually you realize the fear was never as big as it seemed. It was just loud, loud and empty like an echo in an abandoned room. They sat together in silence for a while, two men from different worlds, connected by something deeper than celebrity or craft. Connected by the universal human experience of struggling, of searching, of trying to find meaning in a life that doesn't come with instructions. When they returned to training, something had changed. Jimmy moved differently. Not better, necessarily. He still missed blocks, still telegraphed strikes, still struggled with combinations that should have been automatic by now. But there was a new quality to his movement, a willingness to fail, a refusal to apologize for his imperfection. Keanu noticed. Of course he noticed everything. "There you are," he said quietly, as Jimmy completed a sequence with more intention than precision. "That's the person I've been waiting to meet." That night, Jimmy went home and did something he hadn't done in years. He called his mother. Not for any particular reason, not with any agenda or schedule to keep. He just called because he wanted to hear her voice, because he wanted to tell her he loved her, because he suddenly understood that the moments we put off are the moments we lose forever. They talked for 2 hours, about his father, about his childhood, about the fears she had never expressed and the dreams she had quietly abandoned. And somewhere in that conversation, Jimmy realized that he wasn't the only one who had been hiding. Everyone was hiding. Everyone was performing some version of themselves that they thought the world required. The only difference was whether you had the courage to take off the mask. When he hung up the phone, his wife was standing in the doorway, watching him with tears in her eyes. "I don't know what's happening to you," she said softly, "but I like it. I like who you're becoming." Jimmy crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. He held her for a long time, not saying anything, just breathing, just being present. And in that moment, he understood something he had been too busy to grasp before. This was what mattered. Not the ratings, not the applause, not the endless pursuit of approval from strangers who would never know the real him. This quiet, imperfect, beautiful moment with the woman he loved, this was everything. But even as peace settled into his bones, a shadow was forming at the edges of his new life. A test was coming, one that would push him beyond anything the training had prepared him for. And it would arrive in the form of a single phone call, at 3 in the morning, with news that would bring his entire world crashing down. The phone rang in the darkness, that harsh electronic sound that always means something terrible when it comes in the dead of night. Jimmy fumbled for it, his heart already racing before he even saw the screen. His mother's name glowed in the dim light, and in that fraction of a second before he answered, he knew. He knew the way you always know when the universe is about to change. His sister had collapsed. A brain aneurysm, sudden and devastating, discovered only when she didn't wake up that morning. She was in surgery now, the doctors offering no promises, no reassurances, only the clinical language of uncertainty that hospitals use when they don't want to give false hope. Jimmy sat on the edge of his bed, the phone still pressed to his ear long after his mother had stopped speaking, and felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He flew to New York that same morning. The training was forgotten. The show was forgotten. Everything was forgotten except the desperate need to be beside his sister, to will her back to consciousness through sheer force of love. The flight felt endless, each minute stretching into hours, his mind cycling through memories he hadn't accessed in years. His sister teaching him to ride a bike. His sister defending him from bullies in middle school. His sister sitting in the audience at his first real comedy gig, laughing louder than anyone else, not because the jokes were good, but because she believed in him. The hospital was cold and sterile, all harsh lights and hushed voices, and the constant beeping of machines that measured life in digital pulses. Jimmy found his mother in the waiting room, smaller than he remembered, older, held together by nothing but faith and terror. They embraced without speaking, because what words could possibly matter in a moment like this? The surgery lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of pacing and praying and bargaining with a God Jimmy wasn't sure he believed in anymore. 9 hours of watching his mother age in real time, of feeling his own helplessness like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. All his success, all his money, all his connections, none of it mattered here. He couldn't charm his way out of this. He couldn't make anyone laugh. He could only wait and hope and confront the brutal truth that control was always an illusion. When the surgeon finally emerged, her face was unreadable. Jimmy's heart stopped. The world stopped. Everything hung suspended in that terrible moment before the words that would either save or destroy. "She made it through the surgery," the doctor said. "The next 48 hours will be critical, but she's fighting." Fighting, his sister was fighting. Just like he had been learning to fight in that training facility that now seemed like it existed in another lifetime. But this wasn't choreography. This wasn't practice. This was real, and the stakes were everything. Jimmy stayed at the hospital for 4 days. He slept in chairs, ate vending machine food, watched the sun rise, and sat through windows he never opened. His producers called repeatedly, gently reminding him about the show, about commitments, about the machine that required his presence to function. He ignored every message. For the first time in his career, the show didn't matter. Nothing mattered except being present for the people he loved. On the 3rd day, his sister opened her eyes. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden gasp of awakening, no tearful immediate reunion, just a slow flutter of eyelids, a confused wandering of her gaze, and then recognition. She saw Jimmy. She saw their mother. And though she couldn't speak yet, though tubes and wires made her look more machine than human, she smiled. A small, weak, impossibly beautiful smile. Jimmy broke down completely. All the training, all the work he had done on controlling his emotions, on staying present under pressure, it dissolved in that moment. He sobbed like a child, clutching his sister's hand, letting years of unspoken love pour out of him in waves of gratitude and relief. And he wasn't ashamed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't ashamed of his tears. His mother held his other hand. The three of them sat there, connected by touch and history and the miracle of survival, and Jimmy understood something that all the training in the world couldn't have taught him. Strength isn't about not breaking. Strength is about breaking and still being there, still loving, still showing up. When he finally returned to Los Angeles a week later, he was a different man. The training facility was waiting for him, unchanged, those same worn mats and handwritten notes, and the smell of discipline that had greeted him on that first uncertain day. But he was not the same person who had walked through those doors weeks ago. He was someone new, someone forged in the fire of almost loss, shaped by the reminder that life is fragile and precious and not guaranteed. Keanu was there, as he always was. He took one look at Jimmy's face and understood without needing to be told. "You're ready," he said simply. Jimmy shook his head. "I don't feel ready. I feel like I've been torn apart and put back together wrong." "That's exactly how ready feels," Keanu replied. "When you've been broken by something real and you're still standing and you choose to keep going anyway, that's when you discover what you're actually made of." They trained that day with an intensity that surprised even Jimmy. His body moved differently now, informed by something beyond technique. Every strike carried the weight of everything he had experienced. Every block was a refusal to be knocked down by life's cruelty. He wasn't just learning to fight anymore. He was learning to live. Hours later, exhausted and exhilarated, Jimmy stood in the center of the mat and realized he was no longer afraid. Not of failure, not of judgment, not of being seen for who he really was. The fear was still there, it would always be there, but it had lost its power over him. It was just another emotion now, no more controlling than joy or sadness or love. "There's something I want to ask you," Jimmy said, his voice steady in a way it had never been before. "The segment, the reason I started all this, I want to do it differently than we planned. I want to show people what really happened here, not just the training, everything, the tears, the fear, the breakdown, all of it." Keanu studied him for a long moment. "That's a big risk. People expect you to be funny. They expect you to keep things light if you show them this." "If I show them this, maybe someone else who's struggling will feel less alone," Jimmy finished. "Maybe someone else who's hiding behind their own performance will find the courage to take off the mask. That's worth the risk. That's worth everything." Keanu's face broke into the most genuine smile Jimmy had ever seen on him. "That's the most courageous thing you've said since we started." The decision was made. The segment would air, but it would be unlike anything Jimmy had ever done before. It would be raw. It would be honest. It would be the most terrifying thing he had ever put on television. And it would change everything. The night of the taping, Jimmy stood backstage at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, and for the first time in over 2 decades, he felt like a beginner. The familiar sounds of the studio surrounded him, the murmur of the audience, the shuffle of crew members, the low hum of cameras warming up. But they felt alien now, like returning to a childhood home and finding all the furniture rearranged. He had done this thousands of times. He had walked onto that stage with a smile and a joke and the unshakable confidence of a performer who knew exactly what was expected of him. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was about to break every rule he had ever learned about entertainment. Keanu was there, waiting in the green room with a stillness that grounded everything around him. He wasn't dressed for a fight scene. He wore a simple black shirt, jeans, nothing remarkable. But his presence filled the room the way it always did, that rare quality of being completely and utterly himself without apology or performance. "You nervous?" Keanu asked. "Terrified," Jimmy admitted. "But the good kind, I think, the kind that means something matters." The audience didn't know what was coming. They expected the usual format, a monologue, some jokes, maybe a fun celebrity game or a lip-sync battle. They had come for laughter, for escape, for the comfort of predictable entertainment. What they were about to receive was something else entirely. When Jimmy walked onto the stage, the applause was automatic, conditioned by years of expectation. He stood at his mark, looked out at the sea of faces, and felt the weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders. For a split second, he almost retreated into the safety of his usual routine. He could feel the jokes waiting in his throat, the practiced rhythm of comedy that had carried him through every uncertain moment of his career. But then he thought of his sister in that hospital bed. He thought of his mother's hands shaking as she waited for news. He thought of Keanu's words about courage, about showing up even when you're afraid. And he made a choice. He didn't tell a single joke. Instead, he started talking. He told them about the training, about showing up at that facility expecting a comedy segment and discovering something far more profound. He told them about Keanu's patience, about the way he never judged, never pushed, just witnessed. He told them about the tears he had shed on that training mat, about the walls that had crumbled inside him, about the decades of performance he had mistaken for authentic living. The audience went quiet. Not the polite quiet of waiting for a punchline, but the deep, absorbed quiet of people recognizing their own experience in someone else's story. Jimmy could feel the cameras capturing every unguarded moment, every crack in his carefully constructed image, and he kept going anyway. He told them about his sister, about the phone call in the darkness, about sitting in that hospital, powerless and afraid, realizing that all his success meant nothing if he lost the people he loved. About the moment she opened her eyes and how that small miracle had rearranged his entire understanding of what mattered. By the time Keanu walked onto the stage, the atmosphere had transformed completely. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something sacred, a moment of genuine human connection being broadcast to millions of people who had tuned in expecting to be distracted from their lives and instead found themselves confronted with the truth of their own. Together, they demonstrated what Jimmy had learned. Not the flashy choreography of movie fights, but the fundamentals, the stances, the breathing, the way you plant your feet and find your center. Jimmy moved with a grace that surprised even him, his body remembering what his mind had barely begun to understand. And between the movements, they talked about loss, about fear, about the courage it takes to be genuinely seen. The segment ran long. The producers were frantic in his earpiece, reminding him about commercial breaks and scheduling, about all the carefully calibrated pieces of the show that were being disrupted. Jimmy ignored every instruction. For the first time in his career, he trusted that what was happening in this moment was more important than any predetermined plan. When it was over, when the last words had been spoken and the cameras cut away, the audience did something unexpected. They didn't applaud immediately. They sat in silence for a long moment, processing what they had just witnessed. And then one person stood, then another. Then the entire studio was on its feet, not cheering for entertainment, but honoring something real. Backstage, Jimmy's hands were shaking. He didn't know if he had just made the best decision of his career or destroyed everything he had built. The vulnerability was terrifying, even now, even after everything. But when he looked at Keanu, he saw something that steadied him. Pride, not the surface kind that comes from accomplishment. but the deep kind that comes from recognizing courage in another person. "You did something tonight that most people never do," Keanu said quietly. "You told the truth about yourself, about what you're afraid of, about who you're trying to become. That takes more strength than anything I could teach you in a training session." Jimmy nodded, suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline draining out of him and leaving only the raw awareness of what he had just done. "I don't know what happens now. I don't know how people will react. Maybe they'll think I've lost my mind. Maybe the ratings will tank. Maybe." "Maybe none of that matters," Keanu interrupted gently. "Maybe the only thing that matters is that you finally let yourself be seen. Whatever comes next, you'll handle it, because you're not hiding anymore." That night, Jimmy went home and sat with his wife in their backyard. The California sky was clear, the stars visible in a way they rarely were in the city. She leaned her head on his shoulder and said nothing, just breathed, just existed beside him. And in that silence, Jimmy felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of problems, not the guarantee of success. Just peace. The kind that comes from finally being aligned with yourself, from knowing that whatever happens, you showed up honestly. The response came the next morning, and it was overwhelming. The internet was flooded with reactions. Critics who had spent years dismissing Jimmy as lightweight and inoffensive suddenly wrote lengthy pieces about courage and vulnerability in media. Social media exploded with people sharing their own stories, their hidden fears, their secret struggles, the masks they wore every day to survive in a world that seemed to demand performance. What Jimmy had done wasn't just a segment anymore. It was a movement. It was permission. It was proof that authenticity could still break through the endless noise of manufactured content. But more important than the public response were the private messages. Thousands of them, from parents struggling to connect with their children, from teenagers who felt unseen and unheard, from men who had never been told it was okay to cry, to feel, to admit they were scared, from people who watched Jimmy Fallon fall apart on national television and thought, for the first time, maybe I'm not alone. Maybe it's okay to not be okay. Maybe the bravest thing I can do is stop pretending. Jimmy read as many as he could. Each story hit differently. Some made him laugh through tears, some made him sit in heavy silence. All of them reminded him why he had taken the risk. This was what mattered, not the ratings, though they were the highest his show had ever seen. Not the headlines, though they were everywhere. These connections, these moments of recognition between strangers, this was the point. Keanu called him a few days later. They hadn't spoken since the taping, both of them processing the aftermath in their own ways. "How are you holding up?" Keanu asked. Jimmy considered the question honestly before answering. "I feel like I've been turned inside out, like everything that was hidden is now visible and I can't put it back even if I wanted to." He paused. "It's terrifying, but also freeing. I don't know how to explain it." "You don't have to explain it," Keanu said. "I understand completely." They made plans to train again. Not for any segment, not for any audience, just for themselves. Because the work wasn't finished, it was never really finished. The journey toward authenticity wasn't a destination but a practice, something you showed up for every day, something that required constant attention and courage. Months later, Jimmy found himself back in that same training facility. His body was stronger now, his movements more refined. But more importantly, his relationship with himself had transformed. He no longer performed happiness when he was sad. He no longer hid his fears behind jokes. He learned to sit with discomfort, to let emotions move through him without resistance, to trust that he could survive whatever life brought. His sister recovered fully. She told him later that watching his segment from her hospital bed had been the first moment she truly believed she was going to be okay. "If you could do something that brave," she said, "then I could fight my way back. We're made of the same stuff, you know." His daughters noticed the change too. They started having conversations they had never had before, about fear, about failure, about what it meant to be authentic in a world that constantly pushed toward performance. Jimmy learned that his vulnerability gave them permission to be vulnerable too, that his willingness to be seen created space for them to stop hiding. And his wife, she told him one night as they lay together in the darkness, that she had fallen in love with him all over again. "I always loved you," she said, "but now I know you, the real you, and that's so much better than the version you were trying to sell the world. The last training session with Keanu happened on an ordinary Tuesday, 6 months after that first uncertain day when Jimmy had walked into the facility expecting a comedy segment and found something that would reshape his entire life. They moved through combinations with ease now, their bodies synchronized, their breathing matched. When they finished, both covered in sweat and breathing hard, they stood facing each other in the center of the mat. "I don't know how to thank you," Jimmy said. "I came here thinking I was going to learn some fight moves for television. Instead, you taught me how to be human." Keanu shook his head. "I didn't teach you anything. I just created space for you to remember what you already knew. The courage was always yours. The capacity for change was always inside you. I just helped you find it." They embraced then, two men who had become unlikely friends, connected by something deeper than profession or proximity. Connected by the shared experience of suffering and survival, of loss and love, of learning that strength is not the absence of weakness but the willingness to acknowledge it. As Jimmy drove home that evening, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. The fear he had carried for so long, believing it made him weak. The performance he had mistaken for living. The walls he had built to protect himself from rejection, not realizing they were also keeping out everything that mattered. He thought about Keanu's losses, the daughter, the girlfriend, the grief that no amount of success could erase. And he thought about how that man had transformed his suffering into wisdom, his pain into presence, his brokenness into a gift he offered freely to others. That was the real lesson, not the punches or the blocks or the choreography of combat. The real lesson was that our wounds don't have to destroy us. They can teach us. They can deepen us. They can become the very thing that connects us to other wounded people stumbling through this world, searching for meaning. Jimmy Fallon went on to host The Tonight Show for many more years. He still made people laugh. He still played games with celebrities and did musical impressions and brought joy to millions of viewers every night. But something had fundamentally shifted. There was a depth to his humor now, a warmth that hadn't been there before. People could feel it even if they couldn't name it. The performance had become authentic. The mask had become the face. And whenever someone asked him about that segment, about the training, about Keanu, about the moment he cried on national television, he always said the same thing. "I spent 49 years thinking I knew who I was. Turns out I had no idea. It took learning to throw a punch to finally understand that the real fight was never with anyone else. It was always with the stories I told myself about my own limitations." He would pause then, a small smile on his face. "Keanu taught me something I'll never forget. He taught me that being brave doesn't mean being unafraid. It means being terrified and showing up anyway. It means letting people see you, really see you, even when every instinct tells you to hide." The sun was setting over Los Angeles as Jimmy pulled into his driveway. His daughters ran out to greet him, full of stories about their day. His wife stood in the doorway, smiling that smile that still made his heart skip after all these years. He gathered them all in his arms and held them close, breathing in the ordinary miracle of this moment. He was home, not just physically, but in every way that mattered. After a lifetime of searching, Jimmy Fallon had finally found his way back to himself. And that, more than any achievement or accolade, was the greatest victory of all. Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin in the most ordinary ways. A phone call, an invitation, a choice to step outside the boundaries of who you think you are. Jimmy Fallon walked into a training facility expecting to learn how to throw a punch. He walked out knowing how to live. And somewhere in Los Angeles, in a simple facility with worn mats and handwritten notes on the walls, Keanu Reeves smiled. Because he knew what Jimmy was only beginning to understand. The transformation was never about the training. It was always about the courage to begin.